Prophet Robbie Warren had visions that shook his faith, while powerful church leader Brian Carn wielded influence wrapped in secrets. When Robbie dared to speak out, warnings were ignored, and a dangerous truth began to unravel, revealing secret affairs, manipulation, and a network of fear hiding behind the pulpit. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. In early February 2023, Prophet Robbie Warren began experiencing strange and deeply unsettling dreams. At first, they seemed random, vague flashes of figures in long robes, dark churches, muffled cries, and whispers in the background. But the dreams kept coming, night after night, each one growing more vivid and disturbing than the last. He saw a man, always the same man, standing in front of large crowds with a microphone in hand. The man looked confident, powerful, even adored by the people around him. Yet behind him shadows flickered like smoke, and unseen forces loomed just out of reach. The dreams always ended the same way, with Robbie waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and one name ringing in his ears: Brian Carn. At first Robbie didn't understand what he was seeing. He wondered if it was spiritual warfare, maybe even a trick of the enemy trying to confuse him. As a seasoned prophet and pastor, he was no stranger to spiritual visions. But these were different. They weren't symbolic or poetic. They were detailed and specific. He saw faces. He heard names. He even recognized certain locations: hotel rooms, dressing rooms, green rooms behind church stages. It was as if he were being shown something real, something current. Unable to shake the feeling, Robbie began writing the visions down in a journal. Over a few weeks, patterns started to emerge. One reoccurring image was that of a black journal, filled with secrets, hidden notes, initials, times, and symbols he didn't recognize. Another was of a locked room, guarded by silence and shame. He began to notice the fear in the dream scenarios, especially from young women. Their faces were blurred, but their body language was unmistakable: anxious, cornered, controlled. Still Robbie hesitated. Accusing a man like Brian Carn, a popular prophetic figure with a massive following, was no small matter. Carn was known for televised church services, large-scale conferences, and an almost celebrity-like status in the Christian world. Speaking out against someone so revered could cost Robbie his reputation, his relationships, even his ministry. But the visions wouldn't. They began to bleed into his waking hours. During prayer meetings, Robbie would feel overwhelmed by the same emotions from his dreams: unease, grief, anger. One Sunday morning, as he stood before his small but loyal congregation, he felt an undeniable urge to say something. With trembling hands, he closed his Bible and looked out over the room. He spoke cautiously, not naming anyone directly, but warning of a spirit of deception hiding in a respected leader. He urged his members to pray, to be vigilant, and to seek truth no matter how painful it might. The reaction was immediate. Some in the room exchanged glances. A few stared down at their hands. One woman got up and quietly left. After service, several members approached him, clearly disturbed by what they'd heard. Most didn't say anything at all. Over the next few weeks, attendance started to dip. Robbie noticed that even some of his most faithful supporters were suddenly distant. He began receiving vague messages from ministry colleagues, gently cautioning him to focus on the word and avoid unnecessary drama. One pastor even told him, "Be careful, brother. These kinds of things can get messy." It was clear his warning had made waves, and not everyone wanted those waves to keep growing. Yet deep down, Robbie knew he was right to speak. Something was wrong, something dangerous, and if he was the only one willing to say it, then he'd do so, no matter the cost. He didn't yet know just how far the truth would reach, or how many lives it would shake, but he had taken the first step, and once that door was opened, there would be no closing. Brian Carn had built a name for himself that stretched far beyond the pews of any single church. He was more than a pastor, he was a brand. His rise in the prophetic movement was meteoric. Videos of his accurate prophecies had gone viral, with thousands of people flocking to his services, believing they were in the presence of a man directly connected to the voice of God. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove luxury cars, and traveled the country hosting conferences where people paid just to be in the room. His social media platforms portrayed him as both a spiritual general and a lifestyle icon, holy but polished, approachable but to the outside world. Carn represented the modern prophetic leader, sharp, fearless, and in control, but behind the curtain, things were different. His public confidence masked an intense need for control. Those closest to him quickly learned that access came at a price. The inner circle was tight, and once inside, you didn't question anything. There were no mistakes allowed, no pushback. People who had once worked closely with him began to describe an atmosphere that was more corporate than spiritual, structured, strategic, and designed to keep Carn at the center of everything. Former staffers began reaching out to Robbie in private. One described a situation where ministry assistants were rotated every few months, not because of performance, but to prevent anyone from becoming too comfortable or asking too many questions. Another shared how women who joined the ministry were often quickly promoted to roles that gave them direct access to Carn, even if they lacked experience. Many of these women eventually disappeared from the spotlight with no explanation. Still, no one spoke openly. Fear ran deep. Those who left the ministry rarely shared why. Some said they had experienced spiritual burnout. Others claimed God had moved them in another direction. But to Robbie, these stories didn't sound like natural transitions. They sounded like silencing. One striking detail came from a musician who had played in Carn's services for several years. He recalled being told never to interact with certain people unless Carn had given specific permission. He also described seeing women in tears backstage, only to reappear minutes later smiling on camera. No one asked questions. Everyone knew better. Church members who had once felt empowered under Carn's leadership began to express a different kind of loyalty, one based on fear rather than faith. Some felt spiritually obligated to stay, convinced that leaving would bring judgment. Carn was known to say that those who walked away from his ministry walked away from the covering of God. To a vulnerable believer, that was a terrifying thing. The deeper Robbie looked, the more clear the pattern became. Carn's public persona was crafted with precision. Sermons were rehearsed, spontaneous prophecies often pre-planned. His media team was instructed to delete any unflattering testimonials from members were edited before being shared online. It wasn't ministry anymore, it was a performance. Robbie realized that the man people were following wasn't real. He was a projection carefully maintained to draw people in and keep them loyal, but the loyalty was conditional. It depended on obedience, silence, and submission. Those who broke that silence, even quietly, were made examples of. Some were publicly rebuked, others were simply erased from ministry life without a trace, and yet despite the fear, cracks had begun to form. The perfect image was starting to chip. People were asking quiet questions, anonymous messages were surfacing online, and those with buried stories were now watching closely, waiting for someone brave enough to say what they couldn't. Robbie Warren had already begun the process, and the deeper he went, the more dangerous the truth became. A few weeks after Robbie Warren shared his warning, the silence surrounding Brian Carn's inner circle began to shift. It started with a message, anonymous, brief, and sent through a burner email. The sender claimed to be a former member of Carn's ministry team, and asked if Robbie was willing to hear the truth. The message ended with a single line, "You're not wrong, but you have no idea how deep it goes." Robbie responded cautiously. He'd received strange emails before, but something about this one felt different. Over the next few days, two women came forward, separately, but with disturbingly similar stories. Both had worked closely with Carn during different periods, and both claimed to have been involved in secret, emotionally manipulative relationships with him. The first woman said she had met Carn after responding to a leadership invitation posted on social media. Within weeks she was traveling with the ministry team, and had been singled out for mentoring. At first, it felt like a spiritual promotion, but soon, private meetings became late-night calls, emotional boundaries blurred, and the language of prophecy was used to justify increasing intimacy. She said Carn told her they were spiritually connected, and that their relationship was divinely ordained. When she tried to pull back, she was met with guilt, accusations of rebellion, and even warnings that touching the anointed would bring spiritual consequence. The second woman had a similar story. She was placed in what was called a restoration program, supposedly meant to help her heal from past trauma. But the one-on-one sessions with Carn quickly turned into something else: private dinners, hotel visits, during conferences, and a growing fear that saying no would mean spiritual abandonment. She showed Robbie screenshots of messages, long texts, filled with scripture, mixed with personal language, flattery, and veiled threats. The manipulation was subtle but devastating. Both women agreed on one thing: they had tried to speak up before but no one listened. They said others in the ministry knew, or at least suspected, but were too afraid to question anything. Those who did were either pushed out, or quietly left on their own. The women believed that Carn had created a culture where questioning him meant questioning God. That level of control didn't just silence them, it convinced them for a long time that their pain was part of their spiritual growth. Robbie listened carefully. He recorded their testimonies, blurred their faces in his private notes, and began documenting everything: text messages, emails, conference schedules, and ministry rosters. He noticed how the women were always rotated in and out of public view, rarely seen for more than a few months at a time. It was as if there was an invisible system in place, one designed to cycle them through, keep them quiet, and protect the image of the ministry at all costs. As word spread quietly that Robbie was investigating, more people started reaching out. Some shared stories, others offered names. A few simply said, "Thank you for speaking." Many refused to go on record, but confirmed that they had seen or heard things they couldn't explain, and didn't feel safe asking about. The picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't just about affairs or bad decisions. It was about power, control, and the way spiritual authority could be twisted into something dark when left unchecked. Robbie knew what he had now wasn't just rumor, it was evidence, real stories, real damage, and for the first time he understood why the dreams had been so urgent. The visions weren't a warning of something coming, they were a revelation of something already happening, something hidden in plain sight, and now that the truth was starting to surface, there would be no turning back. The black journal arrived without warning. It came in a plain, unmarked envelope, dropped through the mail slot of Robbie Warren's church office. No return address, no message, just the book itself, worn and weathered, its leather cover creased from use. Robbie opened it cautiously, unsure what he was holding. Inside were pages filled with tight, hurried handwriting, initials, symbols, and dates. Some entries were short, cryptic phrases, others read like schedules or instructions, but the deeper he read, the more disturbing the content became. One page listed initials followed by locations, hotel names, room numbers and times. Another had references to healing sessions, personal deliverance, and spiritual bonding. The language was vague but deeply unsettling, especially when paired with what the women had already told him. One entry dated only weeks before, simply read, "Tired of crying, he says I'm chosen but I feel disposable." That line stuck with Robbie. It didn't sound like prophecy, it sounded like pain. Some pages were even more confusing. Symbols, small crosses, circles, and arrows appeared next to names. In certain places entire lines were blacked out with thick ink, as if someone had tried to hide information even from themselves. But what remained was enough to draw a terrifying picture. It appeared to be a kind of internal log, possibly kept by someone within the ministry, someone who had been documenting what they saw, perhaps even what they experienced. Robbie couldn't confirm who had sent it, but the contents matched what multiple women had already described. He began cross-referencing names and dates, some lined up with ministry events that had been live-streamed. One note mentioned a woman being pulled from worship before a big service. Robbie checked the video from that night, and sure enough, the woman was absent from the stage. Another entry noted a last-minute trip to Atlanta, followed by the words regret. These were not random scribbles, they were breadcrumbs. What disturbed Robbie the most were the journal's final pages. That line stuck with Robbie. It didn't sound like prophecy, it sounded like pain. Some pages were even more confusing. Symbols, small crosses, circles, and arrows appeared next to names. In certain places entire lines were blacked out with thick ink, as if someone had tried to hide information even from themselves. But what remained was enough to draw a terrifying picture. It appeared to be a kind of internal log, possibly kept by someone within the ministry, someone who had been documenting what they saw, perhaps even what they experienced. Robbie couldn't confirm who had sent it, but the contents matched what multiple women had already described. He began cross-referencing names and dates, some lined up with ministry events that had been live-streamed. One note mentioned a woman being pulled from worship before a big service. Robbie checked the video from that night, and sure enough, the woman was absent from the stage. Another entry noted a last-minute trip to Atlanta, followed by the words regret. These were not random scribbles, they were breadcrumbs. What disturbed Robbie the most were the journal's final pages. They hinted at something larger than inappropriate relationships. There were notes about financial transfers, mentions of gifts being covered through offering funds, and veiled warnings about getting too close. One page referenced a code of silence, followed by 3 names. Robbie recognized one of them. It belonged to a current staff member still serving under Brian Carn. The journal wasn't proof of a crime, but it was evidence of something methodical and hidden. It suggested intention, planning, and possibly complicity. It painted a portrait of a system built to maintain control and protect the one at the top, no matter what happened to those beneath him. Robbie scanned and copied every page, backing up the files on encrypted drives. He didn't know how long he had before someone realized the journal was gone. If it had been stolen, leaked, or sent in desperation, someone out there knew it had changed hands. And if Carn's inner circle was as protective as everyone claimed, Robbie understood the risk he was now carrying. He began sharing pieces of the journal with trusted allies, pastors, journalists, counselors. Most were shocked, a few were skeptical, but no one could deny the pattern forming. One ministry leader, after reading just 3 pages, whispered, "This is the kind of thing that ends careers or loves." As Robbie stared at the journal, he felt the weight of it settle in his hands. This wasn't just someone's notes, it was a record of pain, a timeline of manipulation, a ledger of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. And now that it was in his possession, Robbie knew he had a choice to make. He could bury it, or he could expose it, and face whatever followed. He had already started down the path. There was no longer any safe way out. Robbie Warren had never imagined that telling the truth could be so isolating. As he dug deeper into the journal's contents, and continued hearing stories from those affected, he began reaching out to fellow pastors and church leaders, people he had prayed with, shared pulpits with, even mentors. He believed that if they saw what he saw, they would understand the urgency. He thought they would stand with him. Instead, the silence was deafening. At first, responses were polite but distant. He was told that every man of God faces false accusation, and that perhaps he was being misled. One well-known bishop, after seeing parts of the journal, suggested Robbie take a sabbatical to clear his spirit. Others simply stopped replying altogether. Speaking engagements he had committed to months prior were suddenly cancelled without explanation. Calls went unanswered. Friends became strangers almost overnight. Behind closed doors, word spread quickly that Robbie was causing division. Some accused him of trying to destroy another man's ministry out of jealousy. Rumors twisted his intentions, painting him as bitter, unstable, or even spiritually compromised. A few leaders hinted that Robbie had always been too intense, too willing to confront sin, too unwilling to play the political games of the modern church world. Then came the intimidation. At first it was subtle. His office was broken into, but nothing was taken except a single flash drive. His church's website was hacked and flooded with spam messages accusing him of lying. On one occasion, he noticed a black SUV parked near his home late at night. It left when he stepped outside, but it returned more than once in the following week. Emails from anonymous addresses warned him to drop the crusade or face the fire. One message included photos of his family, his wife picking up groceries, his son playing in their yard. That was the first time Robbie truly felt afraid. This wasn't just about church politics anymore. This was about control, and the people protecting Carn's image were willing to go far to keep it intact. But even through the fear, Robbie pressed on. He believed too many people had been hurt in silence. The women who had come forward had risked everything. Relationships, reputations, safety. Some were still in therapy. Some had been completely cut off from the church world they once called home. Robbie felt responsible to honor their courage by refusing to back down. He began working late into the night, compiling timelines, organizing testimonies, and securing files with password protection. He used burner phones to contact certain individuals and stopped sharing his location online. His sermons shifted in tone, still rooted in scripture,
but now laced with urgency. He spoke about the dangers of false shepherds, about wolves in sheep's clothing, about judgment beginning in the house of God. Some of his own members grew nervous, a few left the church altogether, others warned him that he was putting everyone at risk, but a small remnant stayed, people who had seen enough to believe that the cost of silence was greater than the cost of truth. Through all of it, Robbie kept thinking about the journal, about the names it contained, about the final pages with warnings written in rushed, almost panicked handwriting. He knew he was getting close to something that someone desperately wanted buried. The more isolated he became, the more convinced he was that this wasn't just a moral failure, it was a structure of fear. The church was supposed to be a refuge, a place of healing and light, but under the surface of certain ministries, it had become a fortress for manipulation, hidden behind the language of prophecy and revival. Robbie wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting to bring the light back in, even if it meant standing alone. By the summer of 2023, Robbie Warren's investigation had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as disturbing visions and a few testimonies, had grown into a complex web of patterns and repeated behaviors too coordinated to be coincident. He noticed how certain tactics kept appearing in different stories: emotional isolation, secrecy disguised as spiritual intimacy, and the subtle twisting of scripture to control people's decisions. It wasn't just about Brian Carn anymore. It was about a system of influence and fear, operating under the appearance of holiness. Robbie started mapping out the structure of Carn's ministry. At the top sat Carn himself, untouchable, celebrated, and protected. Around him was a tight circle of assistants, most of whom had served for only brief periods. Their roles were often vague. Some handled logistics, others acted as armor-bearers, tasked with keeping Carn comfortable and unbothered. Many of them were women in their 20s or early 30s, often introduced to the congregation as daughters in the faith. They were praised publicly but kept under strict supervision. Most had no clear title or job description, just access and silence. New female recruits were frequently placed into what was described as discipleship, a spiritual mentorship program meant to accelerate their calling. But Robbie discovered it usually started with a private meeting with Carn, often in hotel suites, during conferences or in sealed offices at church headquarters. From there, the women were gradually pulled away from family and friends under the guise of protecting their spiritual purity. They were told not to speak with outsiders, especially former members, and to avoid people with rebellious spirits, a term used for anyone who questioned leadership. Some of the women were praised in public sermons, brought on stage or included in travel teams, while others were quietly pushed out with no explanation. One woman told Robbie she had been involved for over a year, convinced she was being spiritually groomed to one day minister alongside Carn. Instead, she found herself emotionally dependent, financially drained, and too ashamed to explain what had happened. There were financial red flags too. Robbie found records showing that several of the women who had left the ministry had donated large sums of money during their time inside the inner circle. Some had given over $10,000 within weeks, with many of those donations labeled as seed offerings or prophetic access. A few had even taken out loans. One woman admitted that she was encouraged to sow everything she had if she truly wanted a breakthrough. Carn would call these moments sacrificial obedience, a test of faith. In reality, they left people spiritually manipulated and
As the ripple effects of Robbie Warren's video continued to spread, the prophetic world found itself at a crossroads. Conferences were canceled. Partnerships once considered unbreakable quietly dissolved. A handful of churches that had invited Brian Carn to speak removed his promotional materials from their websites without explanation. Behind the scenes, leaders scrambled to assess their connections, unsure of what might come out next. Ministries that had long operated in unquestioned unity began to fracture. But inside Brian's camp, a very different atmosphere took shape. Rather than retreat, the ministry doubled down. New sermons were uploaded with fiery declarations about loyalty, betrayal, and false watchmen sent to destroy God's chosen. Brian stood in front of packed crowds, his voice stronger than ever, warning of wolves in sheep's clothing and reminding his followers that attacks were the enemy's confirmation of his calling. The response was calculated, strategic. It wasn't just damage control, it was psychological reinforcement. If you still supported him, it meant you had discernment. If you doubted, you were spiritually blind. For many, this created deep internal conflict. People who had followed Brian for years now faced a painful dilemma. To admit he might be guilty meant admitting they had been deceived. That kind of self-awareness doesn't come easily, especially in environments where questioning leadership is seen as rebellion. So many chose silence. Some walked away quietly. Others clung tighter, convinced they were witnessing a modern-day crucifixion of a prophet under attack. But the evidence kept mounting. Another wave of leaked documents made their way into private ministry forums. These included emails discussing how to handle potential fallout from female members speaking out. One message casually discussed offering covering to a woman in exchange for silence. The tone was cold, administrative, as if spiritual abuse were just another PR issue to manage. It became increasingly difficult for defenders of the ministry to dismiss the claims as rumor. Robbie received another anonymous tip, this one from someone still within the organization. They had seen changes up close, altered expense reports, rewritten timelines, and quiet removals of digital content that might raise suspicion. They said staff had been ordered to delete old photos, erase messages, and scrub mentions of people who had left. The ministry was cleaning house, not in repentance, but in fear. Despite growing pressure, Robbie remained quiet. He released no follow-up video, no interviews. He didn't need to. The truth had gained a momentum of its own. Others began creating content, sharing their stories, and citing his journal as the starting point. Former members who had once feared retaliation now spoke with boldness, realizing they were not alone. A support network began to form, a quiet community of survivors sharing what they had seen, what they had endured, and what it had cost them. Some described financial ruin, having given thousands in obedience to prophetic instruction that never led to breakthrough. Others spoke of broken marriages, emotional trauma, and loss of faith. What united them was not bitterness, but a desire for healing, and a demand for accountability. For the first time, the silence that had protected the ministry for so long was breaking down. And still Brian Carn Still, the lights dimmed, the music swelled, and people fell to the floor in emotional surrender. The stage was untouched, but behind it, a quiet war was unfolding, one between control and truth, manipulation and freedom. Robbie hadn't set out to start a movement, but by simply telling the truth, he had sparked a fire that even the most polished sermons couldn't put out. The question now wasn't whether people would hear the truth, it was whether they would believe it, and whether they were ready to live differently once they did. The days of blind trust were ending, and for those waking up, the cost of silence had already been far too high. The final chapter in this unfolding story didn't come with a bang, but with a slow unraveling that left many shaken to their core. After months of intense scrutiny, whispers in the halls, and growing public awareness, the reality of Brian Carn's ministry couldn't be denied. The walls that once seemed impenetrable began to crumble, exposing not just a man but a system built on secrecy, fear and unchecked power. In the aftermath, a series of investigations began. Independent auditors were brought in to review the financial records that had once been tightly guarded. They uncovered what insiders had feared: significant misappropriation of funds, falsified reports, and transactions designed to obscure the flow of money. These findings didn't just confirm the leaks, they revealed even deeper layers of deception. But the financial scandal was only part of the story. The emotional and spiritual damage was harder to quantify. Support groups formed, not just online, but in homes and quiet meeting rooms across the country. Women and men who had suffered manipulation, abuse, and betrayal found solidarity in shared experiences. Many sought counseling, some pursued legal action, and others chose to rebuild their lives quietly away from the spotlight. Robbie Warren watched from a distance. He remained cautious, aware that exposing truth was only the beginning of healing. He continued to pray for those affected, and for the chance that redemption might still be possible, not just for those who had been hurt, but for Brian Carn himself. He knew the path forward would be difficult, and that forgiveness would require time and sincere repentance. As news outlets eventually picked up the story, the public reaction was, some condemned the ministry outright, others expressed sorrow for the followers who had been deceived, and a few called for renewed accountability in all corners of the prophetic movement. The scandal sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of unchecked spiritual authority and the importance of transparency in ministry leadership. In the days that followed, Brian Carn issued a public statement, He neither fully denied, nor admitted to the accusation. Instead he spoke of personal struggles, challenges in leadership, and the pain of division within the church. Some saw it as an attempt at damage control, others as a first step toward acknowledging a broken system. Regardless, many members remained conflicted, torn between loyalty to a leader they had once trusted, and the harsh truths now revealed. Meanwhile, Robbie's journal, once a private collection of visions and testimonies, became a vital piece of evidence in ongoing inquiry. Scholars, journalists, and ministry watchdogs referred to it as a key document that had helped expose a pattern of deception masked by religious authority. It stood as a testament to the power of quiet perseverance and the courage to speak when others were afraid. The story of Brian Carn and Prophet Robbie Warren didn't end with a courtroom verdict or a public confession. It ended, rather, with a community learning to face uncomfortable truths and seek restoration. The wounds left behind were deep, but for some, they were the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to rebuild faith on a foundation of honesty and genuine accountability. As the dust settled, one thing remained clear: no person, no matter how anointed or charismatic, should stand above scrutiny. The line between faith and manipulation must never be blurred, and the voices that speak out, no matter how small or fearful, are often the ones who carry the greatest light. Robbie Warren's journey from quiet observer to courageous exposer showed that even in the darkest places, truth can break through. It just takes someone willing to shine a light.